Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Manley and this is Made With Books. And today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in October. These are mostly Victober books. Before I get into my wrap up, a huge thank you to Lucy, Ange, Kate and Katie for hosting Victober. I will link all of their channels down below again. It's fantastic that you're doing this every year, and yeah, I had a blast. It was the Frankfurt Book Fair, so I didn't read as much Victorian literature as I would have liked to, especially since I on rather short notice, and that was my own fault, had to read a huge German book for the book fair to interview the author that cut way down on my reading time for Victober. But I still managed to read, I think I counted, I think it was like 17 different authors, and before you're surprised and think I've read that many books, I haven't. I just read poetry. I have this, or we have this 50 English sonnets and English poetry and anthology, and I just read the poems in here that were published during the Victorian period. They were by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti. So I did read a bit of her poetry. I didn't get to her standalone collection that we own. Thomas Hardy, one poem, A Church Romance, which I really liked. Alice Meynell, who I didn't know before, who was in the other one that wasn't in here. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, My Last Duchess, which was a really interesting one. Matthew Arnold, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and A.E. Housman, who I also didn't know beforehand, and one poem by Rudyard Kipling. I will look again at the poems and choose 2 or 3 that I liked in particular, and we'll link those down below so you can read them if you want to. I don't have that much to say about these poems since I just read them at the beginning of the month. I enjoyed them. I liked this way of getting some Victorian literature in, even though it was just, you know, tinier snippets, but still read some. And the first little book I think that I finished for Victober was The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. This fulfilled, I think it was Ange's prompt to read something by a female author, preferably one that you hadn't read anything by before, and I actually had never read anything by Elizabeth Gaskell beforehand. I also fulfilled the prompt to read by candlelight with this book, since I read the first story, The Old Nurse's Story, by candlelight, which, let me tell you, is difficult because we don't have any of those candles that have like really bright light, so I had a bunch of candles lit in this room and sort of like sat like that and try to read the story. But it was great for the atmosphere because these are there's 2 gothic stories in here, so it worked very well. The Old Nurse's Story is a story about, well, an old nurse telling a story about how a little girl she cared for when she was younger had to move, and she moved with her into this sort of old house, and there were these weird noises and things are happening, and it has a ghost child in it, so it was a bit creepy. I liked it. And the second story, called Curious If True, is about a man who's taking a walk and is sort of doesn't find his way home in time, and it gets sort of doesn't get lost in the woods, but he can't walk home in time, and then he finds this I don't remember, it was a house or a castle in the middle of the woods that is lit up, and he goes there and there's this party with all these weird sort of people that he encounters, and after a while you realize who these people are, and it was an interesting story. I liked sort of it took me a while to catch on, but then I don't want to give spoilers, but I really liked that one as well. So this was a really interesting introduction to Gaskell. I do want to read her novels at some point as well. So yeah, that was a good start to Victober. And I have some footage of the reading by candlelight, so I will put that at the end of this wrap up. And then I read The Importance of Being Earnest. This was one of the group read-alongs for Victober that was done in the Goodreads group that I will also link down below. if you still want to check it out. And it was nice getting everybody's comments on this. I had read The Importance of Being Earnest before, so this worked for Kate House Challenge to reread a Victorian book. And once again, I enjoyed it. I chuckled, I laughed out loud, and Daniel was reading next to me. I had a hard time concentrating on his book because I kept quoting this play to him. So I highly enjoyed this. And then the Frankfurt Book Fair happened, so I had a German intermission, if you will. I read Und andere, Formen, menschlichen Versagens and Other Forms of Human Failure by Lennardt Loß. This hasn't been translated, it's only come out this year. Lennardt Loß is an author that, he looks like this, that had a stipend with the place that I work for. And I picked this up this spring and already had read it actually, just because I wanted to read it and it sounded interesting to me. I think I talked about this in my March or April wrap up, so I'm not going to go into more detail here again. Suffice it to say, I enjoyed it again, and I talked to Lennardt at the Frankfurt Book Fair about his book for an event, which is why I reread it. And then the other book that I had to read, because I talked to the author at the Frankfurt Book Fair at our booth for another event. He also used to have a stipend with the place that I work at, but that was before I worked there. His name is Norbert Zähringer. The novel is called Wo wir waren, which translates to Where We Were. It's also just come out this year, I think in September or October, so a very recent publication, so it hasn't been translated into English again. This was nominated for the German Book Prize, which is the biggest literary prize for German novels. I did really enjoy it. It's about the first moon landing on 21st of July 1969, which of course has its 50-year anniversary this year, and it doesn't so much center around the astronauts that landed on the moon or flew around it, but some characters in Germany and what happened to them on the night of the moon landing, and then after that, and also sort of covers the whole 20th century. And it's about this boy Hardy, who at the time was 5 years old, and he runs away one night from the children's home that he lives in and that has terrible conditions. He gets adopted, which happens early on in the book, so this is in a way a spoiler, I would say. It's also about his mother, who that night escapes from prison, and it also tells the story of his grandfather, who Hardy never meets, and it tells the story of it goes through the First World War, the Second World War, it covers the Vietnam War, and a bunch of other events of the 20th century through the characters that are in this book, and it's sort of very interwoven and cleverly done. I did really enjoy it. It was a fast read because, I mean, this is a 500 plus page book, so a bit of a junker, but it was a quick read. I wouldn't say I loved it, but I did really enjoy it. I can see the appeal. I think it sort of reminded me a bit of John Irving in the way that, you know, his stories weave together and come together in the end. It doesn't have these sort of weird elements like bears and wrestling and stuff. But it was really interesting, and yeah, if you do read German, I guess I would recommend this if you like sort of well-told, interwoven narratives. It can feel a bit constructed because it's so well interwoven, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, overall I really enjoyed this, and it was really fun talking to the author about the book, and that was my non-Victorian intermission of the month. And I finished The Warden by Anthony Trollope, which I had started earlier in the month. This was my very first Trollope. It covered Katie's challenge to read a book that has either less than 250 pages or more than 500 pages. Obviously, it fell into the first one. First part of the prompt. I didn't read any that had 500 plus, unfortunately. So the story centers around Septimus Harding, who is the warden and who works for the church in the town of Barchester, which is a fictional town. And the way that it is set up is that the money he receives through what is called Hiram's will, and Hiram was this man who was very wealthy and who lived, I think, like a century ago or something, but like, or at least a few decades ago, and left money to provide for 12 poor men that would live in this sort of, it's called a hospital, to live out their last days. They've worked hard all their life, but they don't have money, so they do receive sort of, I guess, this stipend through this will, and then the other money is given to the warden. Now, the crux of the story is that the will has never been really re-evaluated and hasn't been changed, but over time more money has amassed, and all this money is given to the warden, who doesn't have a lot of work to do, but no extra money goes towards those 12 men. And Mr. Bold, who is actually a very good friend of the warden and also very much in love with his daughter, but sees it as his sort of personal responsibility to fight for justice in those sort of situations, challenges that situation and involves lawyers and wants to question the situation as it is, whether the warden should receive all this money and whether it shouldn't be different and more money should be attributed according to the will to those 12 men. And it sort of goes from there, and it's this fight about how the church at the time sort of used a lot of wealth that was supposed to be for other people, but it's also about this one man whose consciousness forces him to look at himself and re-evaluate the life he's been living over these past years and the wealth he's become accustomed to. And the warden himself is not a selfish man, and he doesn't want this money if he doesn't deserve it, and he wants the truth to come out and find out if what he has been getting is really what he is entitled to. And the thing is, the other people that have a stake in this, the church, so his son-in-law, the husband of his other daughter, his eldest daughter, who is higher up in the church, and is the archdeacon, who is very strict and believes that whatever the church does is the right thing to do, and only wants to prove that and doesn't care to clear the warden's consciousness, struggles against forces like the newspaper, which is the newspaper, and he has a fictional name, but I think it represents the Times, and it has this sort of standoff look at all these churchmen exploiting their wealth and exploiting the poor, and pictures the warden in a very, very unfavorable and unfair light. And the warden gets sort of caught up in the crossfire. The question is, can anybody really win in this situation? I'm not going to get into detail whether anybody does, but it was just a really interesting story, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I suppose you could see it as a bit on the nose with all the, you know, all the sides of the story and the characters, but I still highly enjoyed this, and I will definitely read more Trollope in the future. The next book I picked up for Victober covered Lucy's challenge, which was to read a book, an underrated Victorian book, I should say, that was published in the same year as your favorite Victorian book. Now, I've talked about this before. My favorite Victorian book is Wuthering Heights, and a book that was published in the same year and that I consider to be underrated is Agnes Gray by Anne Brontë. Obviously, the Brontë sisters are well known, but I would argue that Charlotte and Emily Brontë more so than Anne, and especially Agnes Gray is not as well known. I think Anne Brontë is more known for The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. So Agnes Gray is the story of a young woman who at the beginning lives with her family, her father, mother and older sister, and who decides, because the family is in a bit of a difficult financial situation, that she wants to help out and become a governess. She eventually finds a family that she stays with, and she realizes that the job is a lot more challenging in a way that she expected, not because the work itself is so hard, but because the family that she lands in doesn't really appreciate her, and the kids that she lands in that family are very cruel, not necessarily towards her, but for example the boy is very cruel to animals, and they don't really have a moral compass, if you will, and so she's very much out of her elements, and because the parents don't really allow her to discipline the children, and you could argue that in that sense the novel is a bit dated, because discipline here also obviously means beating your children, which, well, during Victorian times I suppose is very common, but she doesn't get any other forms of discipline to be used either, and so she doesn't really have control over these kids, but then is still blamed when the kids don't turn out the way their parents want them to. I'm not giving too much away if I say that she ends up in a second family, because she leaves that one, because that is all on the back of the book. And she lands in this other family and comes across similar challenges. There is a potential love story in here as well. I'm not gonna say whether it is fulfilled at the end or not. And I really enjoyed this. I know people are sort of divided on Agnes Gray. I've seen some booktubers who really love it. I think Alexandra from A Lovely Jaunt really liked it. I know that Sean from Sean the Book Maniac didn't, and I think some others weren't very, I think Britta Böhler wasn't convinced either, but I really enjoyed it. It can be a bit lengthy at times, so I get where people are coming from if they don't like it as much, but again, this was sort of in the same way that The Warden was for me, sort of this quiet narrative that I really enjoyed, and it was perfect for me this month, or last month I should say, because it's November by now as I'm filming this. I also really love the cover design, and I realized the cover design is actually relevant to the story. I don't want to give anything else away, but I really enjoyed that aspect once I realized that. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. I then also read another Oscar Wilde play, which again was part of the group reads, and that was A Woman of No Importance. I also really enjoyed it for different reasons than The Importance of Being Earnest. The Importance of Being Earnest was just delightful and funny and very smart, and A Woman of No Importance is just as smart, of course, because it's Oscar Wilde. And it was still humorous, but I found other aspects of it more fascinating. I mean, I knew that Oscar Wilde was a forward thinker and, you know, ahead of his times in many ways. I didn't expect quite such a feminist play by him though, so I was surprised at that. It's basically the story of one woman, her son, and the man the son is supposed to start working for, and there's a revelation on why his mother doesn't want him to, and the way it unfolds was really interesting. It's very clever, again, it's Oscar Wilde, and I very much loved the resolution of this play, so I highly enjoyed this as well. I then read a tiny non-fiction read, short little, I would say, essays. It's called Of Street Pieman by Henry Mayhew. Katie from Books and Things mentioned this on her channel, and this has excerpts from London Labour and the London Poor, and also from The Great World of London, which was republished as The Criminal Prisons of London. And it's just these short little essays about everyday life in the Victorian era in London, of people who weren't wealthy, of the ways they made a living, selling pies for instance, also about flower girls selling flowers, of people selling live birds. There's also a balloon flight in there. If you are interested at all in sort of these, I guess you could say, more mundane things about the Victorian period, I would recommend this. If you want to read it for literary merit, I wouldn't. He has a lot of lists, so for example he enlists all the different pie fillings and stuff, so I wouldn't say by any means that this is literary. It's just you know, gives you an idea of everyday life. It's not so well written that, you know, you are astounded by the beautiful writing style or anything like that. I wouldn't say that, but it was still an interesting read, so I'm happy I picked it up. And then the other read that I haven't quite finished yet, but I still think I can talk about already, is As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerald Manley Hopkins. This includes quite a bit of Hopkins' poetry and also extracts from his journal. I would say if you are just getting into poetry, this is not the collection to pick up. I found these poems incredibly dense. I had to reread them multiple times. I had to look up analyses online. Now I'm not a native speaker and the language is very dense in these, so that made it more difficult, I grant you that. But even I think if you're a native speaker, there's some words that are no longer in use. I would definitely recommend this though if you like poetry and if you are either love nature descriptions, if you love complex uses of language that are very clever and beautiful, and also if you are religious. Gerald Manley Hopkins was a priest, and his beliefs really shine through in this poetry a lot. So I think if you're religious, you will really love this poetry as well. I will say some of the poems later in this collection are very dark and bleak. That were written towards the end of his life. He died very young at the age of 44, and he suffered from, I mean, you can't make a diagnosis looking back without really talking to the person, but I think there's different ideas of what he suffered from, possible depression or something like that. And if you read these poems, you definitely get that impression. So just keep that in mind if you read those poems. The extracts from his journal I haven't finished yet either. I have still some poems left in here. Contain nature descriptions that are very detailed, that have very interesting simile. Again, very, very dense language, but yeah, really an interesting read. And if you do like poetry that is a bit more complex, then I would definitely say you can pick this one up. I did start at the end of Victober. I started at the Back of the Northwind by George MacDonald, who was a Scottish Victorian writer, and this is a children's book. This little boy called Diamond, he's already met the Northwind, who is presented as a lady with very long hair to him, and he is riding on her on the Northwind in the night. I've only read the first 18 pages so far, so I haven't finished this in Victober. I might continue it in November. If not, I will probably continue it in December, because December is going to sort of be my catch-up month of this year, because I have a lot of books that I started and haven't finished, so I will go back to these in December. So it might just happen that this will happen with this book. So I can't really say yet whether I would recommend this or not. But yes, those were my Victober reads. Thanks again to Kate, Katie, Lucy and Ange for hosting Victober. And also thank you to Claudia from Spinster's Library, who did a music list with Victorian music, and I listened to some of that music whilst reading some of these books, and I really enjoyed that. So thank you, Claudia, for putting that list together. She also did a lot of very interesting videos throughout Victober, so I'll link her channel down below, as well as the other 4. I hope you all had a wonderful Victober as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye guys!